like pilot officer Sam McNabney from Ballymena. He was killed in action over Normandy in 1944. Their record of service and unity of purpose stood above old attitudes that persisted on Ulster's home front. If the issues for the fighting men were straightforward, those on the home front were not. There was even a question mark over who actually had the legal right to control Ulster's ports in time of war.
I think, as most people know, the treaty ports were handed back to the Dublin government in October of 1938. All bar one of them, that is, because it's not generally known that Belfast, in fact, was a treaty port. And that, of course, raises the issue that the treaty regarded all the waters around the island of Ireland as being under the jurisdiction of the Dublin government. And when the Admiralty decided in the summer of 1940 that the port of Londonderry was now the most westerly point from which convoy escorts could operate in the United Kingdom, they had to obtain, or felt that they had to obtain, the approval of the Dublin government before they actually operated out of the city here.
Even in the heat of war, religion continued to bedevil Northern Ireland. Though Protestants were in general wholeheartedly behind the war effort, the Presbyterians and other Protestant churches remained steadfast in their refusal to countenance Sunday entertainment for fighting men stationed in the province. And the Catholic Church was less than wholehearted in its support for the war, fearing a repetition of the Gethsemane of World War I, when the British government proposed to introduce conscription.
A movement was set on foot, really, very reminiscent of the sort of a campaign in 1918 in which the Catholic Church was joined by nationalism and Sinn Féin in a massive crescendo against conscription. Meetings were held throughout Northern Ireland in nationalist areas where tens of thousands of nationalists with bared heads and right hands upraised, really, incanted the 1918 anti-conscription pledge.
In the face of such massive Catholic opposition, Churchill backed away from conscription, despite fierce unionist protests. What further increased Catholic hostility was the fact that the Ulster Home Guard was exempt from conscription. The Home Guard was a branch of the B Specials and therefore entirely Protestant. To Protestants, Catholic opposition to conscription only fueled their belief that Catholics were a Nazi fifth column.
In 1940, the commander of the B Special Constabulary in Derry contacted Andrews, the Prime Minister, to complain that large numbers of men on the RUC blacklist, presumably Republican sympathisers from Donegal, had found work in the classified section of the naval stores in Derry. And the irony was, from his point of view, that these men were working inside on highly classified munitions work and were being protected outside by a large contingent of B Special Constabulary, and something should be done about this.
Far above the atavistic squabbles of nationalist and unionist at Stormont, a military decision was taken which could have plunged Eire into the conflict. It was called Plan W. Plan W was Britain's top-secret strategy for an advance into Eire in the event of a German invasion. It was also probably the blueprint for a British assault without German provocation. 3 armoured divisions would thrust southwards across the border. A brigade of Marines standing by at Milford Haven in Wales would land along Eire's south coast. And, most significantly, another British drive would capture the Lough Swilly treaty port, far from any German threat.
Among the small nations of Western Europe, there are very few which have so far avoided being drawn into the maelstrom of war. But one at least has so far succeeded in maintaining her national integrity. Ireland, the romantic Green Isle of the West, is still at peace. But she has
Certainly, Eire believed that the threat was real. Half her army faced north towards the British in Ulster. Its commander held secret talks with the Germans to discuss assistance should the British invade.
But is prepared for the worst.
A line of minefields was laid on cross-border roads from Donegal to Dundalk, and as a second line of defence, much of Eire's artillery was positioned pointing north.
Now that the whole free world is
7 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the first American troops arrived in Ulster, the beginning of a new and unpredictable element in the already complex Irish situation.
So they came in as the 34th Infantry Division, the 1st Armoured Division. Those were the two spearhead divisions. They came to train here for the first time on their way to Africa for Operation Torch and the liberation of North Africa. And the significance of that should not be underestimated. It was a big political event, and the Americans really started to make an impact in Northern Ireland from that time.
The first Americans actually came into Londonderry in the summer of 1941. They were dressed as civilians, and they caused quite a stir in the city at the time because they were so brightly dressed. No one here had ever seen people as brightly dressed as that, not even in films, because there weren't all that many colour films at the time. Their work was as engineers, and their job, in fact, one of the principal jobs here, was to build what was called Base 1 Europe. And of course, the day that America declared war on Germany and on Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor, these Americans all appeared in United States Forces uniforms. And of course, then the cat was out of the bag. What everybody had suspected all along was true. They were actually United States servicemen.
Ulster became America's training ground, first for the North African campaign and later for the invasion of Europe.
This then led on to the build-up throughout 1943 and into 1944 for D-Day, and fresh divisions coming in, the 2nd, the 5th and the 8th Infantry Divisions, the 82nd Airborne Division, who are out in Saudi Arabia today, a huge element of American troops spread from Fermanagh to Newry to Armagh and up into the north of the province.
The main base for the American Air Force in Europe was Langford Lodge on the shores of Lough Neagh. Here were fitted out the giant bombers that became the scourge of Germany's industrial machine.
The flying fortresses came in fresh from the factories around the United States. They flew in probably by Iceland and then staged into Langford Lodge. They came in virtually in bare metal with no guns fitted, with just virtually bare. The Lockheed Overseas Corporation, who ran the Langford Lodge operation, had them lined up at really another assembly line where they were fitted out with the guns, the bomb aiming devices and all the bits and pieces that were needed for European air war. And it was a round-the-clock production line of aircraft, and they came off that and went straight to the combat crew replacement centres where they matched up with the new crews that came in. Fresh American airmen came in, just trained out in the deserts of Arizona or something like that, and they were matched up with the newly fitted out bombers where they learnt how to fly in the cloud and all the problems of flying in Europe.
When the RAF handed over control of a number of airfields to the Americans, the United States became responsible for the defence of Ulster. The Americans thus became deeply involved in the problems posed by Eire's neutrality. US President Roosevelt was infuriated by de Valera's attitude, so much so that his envoy to Dublin, David Gray, even urged the US to take over the South and installed an American general in de Valera's place. Eire, however, managed to maintain her policy of benevolent neutrality, and US airmen who crashed were returned across the border. One senior US commander, General Jacob Devers, crash-landed near Athenry in County Galway. He took everyone out for dinner, picked up the tab, and then was escorted to the border by his grateful captors, well watered and fed.
It was up at Langford Lodge that Glenn Miller came in and had his famous concert to entertain the airmen up there, and a lot of the the buildings from that era still remain.
Some of the military reasons which brought about the joint Anglo-American action to seal Northern Ireland from Axis spies in Eire. Mr. de Valera's neutrality permits German agents to establish themselves in an easy position for the collecting of vital information.
On the run-up to D-Day, the Americans took no chances. With the British, they sealed off Eire by land and sea. Had D-Day gone wrong, there's little doubt that the Americans would have taken over the country. It was a fitting climax to Ulster's war that German U-boats sailed up the Foyle and surrendered in Derry. A few months later, off the coast of Donegal, their empty hulks were used as target practice by the RAF. Amidst the euphoria of 1945, de Valera, who'd guided his country through the war with such consummate political skill, made a historic blunder.
When the news of Hitler's death arrived in Ireland, really, at the end of April, beginning of May 1945, de Valera, of course, shocked Allied opinion generally by visiting the German legation on Northumberland Road in Dublin with his permanent secretary from External Affairs and expressing condolences on behalf of the Irish people on the death of the Führer.
The passion that surrounded neutrality during the war is now largely forgotten in the Republic, although the dead are still remembered here. It's ironic that roughly the same number of men from the south volunteered to fight for king and country as did from the north, around 40,000, although the figures became a matter of bitter political dispute. The official Garden of Remembrance in Parnell Square now stands as a memorial not just to those who fell in the War of Independence, but to all Irishmen killed in war, from whatever part of the country, whether fighting for Ireland or Britain. But in Northern Ireland, the legacy of neutrality is not forgotten. By her sacrifice and her suffering and her contribution to the war effort, the province believed that she had staked her moral claim to remain part of the United Kingdom. Yet, at the same time, Unionist leaders knew that Britain, in her darkest hour, was prepared to sacrifice her faithful sentinel. The present is still haunted by those voices from the past.
Owing to the action of Mr. de Valera, so much at variance with the temper and instinct of thousands of southern Irishmen who hastened to the battlefront, the approaches which the southern Irish ports and airfields, Irishmen who hastened to the battlefront, the approaches which the southern Irish ports and airfields could so easily have guarded were closed by the hostile aircraft and U-boats. And if it had not been for the loyalty and friendship of Northern Ireland, we should have been forced to come to close quarters with Mr. de Valera or perish forever from the earth.